But there have been some really fantastically crazy things that have gone on in this park over the years. But before we get into all those stories, I should give you a small amount of background. Because of course the Vondelpark is named after this famous old Dutch poet and playwright named Joost van den Vondel, who I'm certain you're all completely familiar with, yeah? Excellent, just say yes, because otherwise I'd have to recite some boring ass 18th century Dutch poetry. And I promise you the Dutch language is not a poetic one. But the land for the park was actually donated to the city by Vondel's widow after his death. But she added, I think, a really interesting condition to that land donation. Because she was a huge animal lover, and around this time period is when Amsterdam had started to institute regulations on dogs being required to stay on the leash when they were out in public. She really didn't like that, so she added the condition on this donation that the land will belong to the city to be used as a park forever, on the condition that dogs are always allowed to run completely free and unfettered throughout this area. Which is a lot of fun, you know, because the dogs in town are generally fairly well trained. They're always running around playing. It can be just a great thing to sit hang back and watch going on. But it does mean if you're going to come back here and grab a patch of grass in some point in the future, just give the ground a good scan. There is a very good likelihood of being some landmines out there for you. But like I said, some crazy things have gone on here over the years. But we want to start off with this guy over here. Anybody want to guess what that might be? Fish? I've heard some great ones over the years, you know, fish and bull and bird, moose, butterfly, frog, or you can just go a different direction and call it a Picasso. And it's a fairly special one actually. It's one of the only 3 outdoor Picasso sculptures that exist in the world. But I think this one's a little bit more unique than the other two because it was actually donated to Amsterdam by Picasso himself back in 1965. And he wanted it set up exactly here because he had been through town around that time, and what he had seen happening in this park he thought was such a crazy thing, he wanted to be a part of it forever. This middle of the 60s was roughly when Amsterdam began to experiment with changing the regulations involving soft drugs. Of course, that was also around the beginning of that huge international movement known as the hippies, who quickly decided that easy access to weed kind of turned Amsterdam into Mecca. So thousands and thousands of these people just flooded into the city basically overnight. And it caused some really big problems around town, mostly really with housing, because we don't really have very much. You know, Amsterdam is the highest population density city in all of Europe, and getting a house in this town is an absolute nightmare. And I kind of want to go through the system here, because when I first came to Amsterdam, I found it absolutely baffling. Because most of the rental houses in town are organized through a central governmental social housing registry. You know, the social housing is not just for poor people, it's for basically everyone. And in one aspect, it is a really fantastic thing, because basically that means the entire city is under rent control, and you can still get really nice apartments in great locations for very low rent. You know, like a couple months ago, I helped a buddy of mine move into a new 2-bedroom apartment in the center on a canal, ground floor with a garden. It's paying 700 euros a month, right? Which is stupidly cheap. You know, anywhere else in Europe you pay dramatically more. But of course there is another side to that coin, you know, government efficiency. There's right now an 8-year-long waiting list. Yeah. And it causes some big problems. Although, to be fair, back in the 60s and 70s really didn't impact the hippies all that much. They were basically dead broke, they couldn't pay any rent at any cost. So they were generally fairly happy to just set up their tents wherever the hell they happened to be at the end of the day. Which is really not a practice that adhere them to the law. You know, the Amsterdam population were really not very happy about wading through giant groups of dirty, long hair, beardy, you know, to get into the museums or a central station or just off their own doorsteps. So the city council came up with a very unique solution, and you're going to see this trend throughout the entire tour. The Dutch had the same problems as everyone else, but they just approached the solution in an entirely different manner. So they just told all these people about this great big park right in the middle of town. Why do you just take your tents down there? So for the next 12 years, we actually had a tent city in Vondelpark with a population somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people, which just had to be pure entertainment. You know, I've seen so many pictures of the park in those days, and it looked fantastic. Tents all over the place, flags and banners in the trees, all these shiny, happy, naked, hairy people bouncing around, banging on drums, having cookouts, smoking joints. They looked like they were having an absolute riot. And to be fair, they got quite organized while they were in the park. You know, they built some toilets in the bushes, but they even went so far as to convert one of the local bars inside the park into a postal delivery hub. You could actually get mail delivered to you living in a tent in the park, right? Probably all from their mothers, begging them to go home, get a haircut, shave that damn beard, and get a real job. All sounding very familiar. But you guys saw that fancy little neighborhood we just rode through on the way in here. You could probably figure out that this is not a poor neighborhood. You know, this is a there's some very wealthy people live right around here. And they were not impressed with their new neighbors. You know, they went from having this beautiful little idyllic park right beside their houses, all calm and peaceful, to having, you know, all night, every night drum circles. There was giant clouds of smoke. There was, you know, the garbage was starting to accumulate, and obviously noise. And they were not happy at all. And they complained for the whole period, to the city council, trying to get these people removed. But there was basically no solution that the city could see, so they just refused to make any adjustments whatsoever. But then the hippies started to go off in the morning to steal the milk off the doorsteps of the locals. And the Dutchies absolutely love their dairy products. You should never, ever deprive them of them. So that was the end of the game. Forget the noise, forget the rats, forget the filth. Stealing milk got everybody kicked out of the park. Right? But they weren't going to leave Amsterdam. They loved this city. And in their years of sort of wandering aimlessly through town, they had begun to notice a lot of empty buildings. Everything from apartments to factories, warehouses, stores, whatever. So now we stopped calling them hippies, because this kicked off the next period in Amsterdam's history, which is known as the squatters' riots. Because these guys just broke into all these places, they barricaded the doors, they hung up family portraits, home sweet home signs. They were overjoyed, free housing, can't beat that. Although obviously the people who own those buildings were not quite as excited, and they did everything they could to try to clear the squatters out. They got the police involved, but that didn't quite work. They started to hire football teams to go through cracking skulls. I know one guy who actually ended up going to jail because he drove his truck into the side of the building trying to knock it down with the people still inside, because he just couldn't get rid of them any other way. But these guys were fighting back, and for about 4.5 years, it was literally a running battle through the streets. These guys were digging the bricks up out of the road at nighttime to build walls so the police couldn't drive down the streets, just throwing the bricks at the police, and as a last line of defense, they would generally go on the rooftops of their buildings. And they began to throw things like paint bombs and televisions, washing machines and refrigerators onto the police below who were trying to clear them out. Then that whole situation ended up in the courts, and it went right through to the top of the Dutch Supreme Court, who decided at the end of the day that those squatters had absolutely every single right to keep their buildings. See, the Dutch are very socially minded people, right? And in a town like Amsterdam has always had such a chronic housing shortage, it's just not considered to be morally or socially acceptable behavior to keep a place empty so that you can maybe sell it for a bigger profit down the road. If you have a building here, you're actually by law not allowed to keep it vacant. You have to put people inside. If it can be used as housing, it absolutely must be used. So the squatters got to keep their buildings. The law still stands. Now, they have changed it fairly dramatically over the years. They've made it much easier to evict these guys nowadays, but if you all want to stick around for like 2 or 3 more months, can't beat free. Now,